We've all been there. You're playing a game of Marvel Snap, and a location flips up, and suddenly you notice it's the same location that you just had in a game before. What's up with that? Why does it happen so much? Is there something going on behind the scenes that we don't know about? Well, I'm KM Best, and I took a deep dive into the math to figure out if location batching is real. Now, what is location batching? Good question. Location batching is the conspiracy theory, let's say, that the locations in Marvel Snap show up after each other more than they should. So if you got a Nidavellir in one game, you get Nidavellir in the next game, and there's a bug of some kind that makes it more likely to show up, right? That is the general theory that has been advanced on Twitter, on Discord. Even some good, experienced players that I know have privately mentioned this theory to me. Like, people in my testing group have been like, I think this is real. I think something is going on. So let's take a look at some of the basic numbers underlying locations in Marvel Snap. First things first, imagine there's a different game. Let's call it Marvel Pans. Now, in Marvel Pans, there are 100 possible locations. Each of them is equally likely to flip up in any given game. There are 3 chances for those locations to flip up. Now, you might think that means any given location has a 1 in 100 chance of flipping up. That's not actually true. That's because there are 3 chances per slot. So, in order to figure out what the likelihood in Marvel Pans of flipping up the same location from the game before, we look to a pretty simple formula. This is the base formula, again in Marvel Pans, which is our simplified universe, of what you would need to do to figure out exactly how likely it would be for locations to repeat. We start with 97 out of 100. Why 97 out of 100? Because we're in game 2, we just saw 3 locations, so what we're doing here is we're looking for the chances for those locations not to repeat, and then we'll look at the difference between those things. So, 97 out of 100 is the chance for on the first flip up, for it to be a location that was not in the previous game. Moving on to the next one, we remove that first location from the set, so it becomes 96 out of 99. That is the chance for the second location to flip up and have it not be a location from the game we just played. Then moving on to the third location, we have 95 out of 98, because of course, 2 locations have already been flipped up and removed from the set, and that third location now at 95 out of 98. That is the chance, again, for it to be not a location from the previous game. Then we multiply all of those together and find that the actual chance for it to not be a location for a previous game ends up being about 92%, which means there's about an 8% chance, again, in theory land, that you will see a location from your previous game in Marvel Pans. Let's move on to actual Marvel Snap, though. In Marvel Snap, there are 4 kinds of locations: common, uncommon, rare, and ultra rare. Each of these locations is assigned a weight, and then also each of these locations, there are different numbers of them. So they are weighted according to the weight given to them and according to the different numbers. Now, I know this sounds a little bit complex. Imagine a big bowl, right? Every common location, let's say it's Nidavellir, right? You get your common location, you pour 200 Nidavellirs into that bowl, right? And there are 63 common locations, so for each of those 63 common locations, you pour 200 of them into that bowl, right? Then you move on to the uncommon locations, you pour 125 of them into the bowl. And then you move on to the rare locations, you pour 75 of them into the bowl. And then, of course, the ultra rare locations, which currently are just ego and world ships, you put 15 egos, 15 world ships, just a dash, right? And then, when you are actually in the game, what the game will do is jam its hand into that bowl, swirl around, and just come out with something. We've pulled out ego. All right, so you pulled out ego. That's location 1. Now, that's one of the 15 possible egos in there. Those 15 are now removed from the bowl, however, because you can't repeat locations. All right, next location, the game rummages around. Oh, Wakandan Embassy, right? Wakandan Embassy, that's a common location. So that Wakandan Embassy disappears, and so do the 200 other possibilities for you to pull Wakandan Embassy, etc., etc. This is how the game chooses locations, as I understand it. These weights were data mined by the people over at Snap.fan, and I thank them profusely for this because none of this work would have been possible if we did not have these weights. So when you look at the actual bowl, right, the overall bowl, there's about, give or take 17,000 possibilities, but each of those possibilities is influenced by the rarity of the location that has already flipped up. The vast majority of locations in your game are going to be common. So what's the easiest way, knowing the weights, to actually figure out how likely this is going to be in Marvel Snap, not in Marvel Pans? Well, this is the easiest way. It is just throwing them all into a Python program and telling the Python program, all right, here are the parameters, run this 100,000 times and tell me how likely it is to happen. So we did that a couple times, and here is one of the results that we got. I will have another one on the screen in a second, and in this one, we got 8728 out of 100,000 times, so in other words, 8.728% of the time, we saw a repeating location from the previous game played. About 8.7% of the time, you should see a repeating location. That's pretty wild, right? Anyway, I ran this a bunch of times, right? Like, I'm kind of stupid. I'm like, okay, 100,000. Let's see how many of those 100,000. Let's do a couple more than 100,000. But like, I kept running it, and yeah, it was pretty consistent. Basically, between like 8.5 to 9% of the time, this would happen. And that is with the weights that Marvel Snap actually has on it. And this is a program, you can copy this program. It's like 16 lines of code, and you can run it for yourself. Let me know if you get anything outside of 8.5 to 9, because I sure didn't. And this is where we stopped on the first day of research, although research in my Discord did continue. And while we're here, I just want to give a couple of big shout outs. MathematicalSnapistician came up with the Marvel Pans thing. This code was written by BoopsBoops in my Discord, and a lot of the heavy lifting on the math you're about to see was done by Ridiculous Hat and NullSet, also in my Discord, so just enormous kudos to them. I have a degree in a relatively math-related field from college, and this was still like, I can understand what's going on, but it's not like I would know how to solve this problem, so I'm very glad that I was able to lean on the shoulders of others for this. So here's where the ridiculous math starts happening. So we took into account that, okay, remember we talked about the big bowl and how every time you pulled a location out of the bowl, all of the other possibilities for pulling that location would also get pulled out of the bowl. This is the math on how likely it is that you see a repeat based on various location rarity combinations. Note that here M is being used for ultra rare, just so there weren't two U's in there. Shout out to Magic the Gathering. Used Mythic for that instead of ultra rare due to the Magic naming convention. So that's what this is. It's a really remarkable piece of work done mostly, I believe, by NullSet and Ridiculous Hat. And if you really want to dive into it, I can make this document public. You should probably be able to find it in the description below, so you guys can play around with this. Let me know if you see anything wrong. But basically what it means is, depending on the locations in your previous game, you have anywhere from, you have a pretty reasonable chance. At the high end, you have, like, with certain location possibilities, like you look at if all your locations were common, you actually have like a 10% chance of seeing one of those locations in the next game. And I know it sounds ridiculous, but it actually makes a little bit of sense to me at this point. This is when it all started coming together for me, because I was thinking of each of these as a discrete event. Like, if I got Wakandan Embassy and then I got Wakandan Embassy again, like, isn't that crazy? Shouldn't that never happen? Isn't that like 1 in 100? And it's like, kind of, but also you get just like a ton of shots at it, right? You get the 3 shots of there being 3 locations, and also each of the locations is a chance to repeat, right? So it's not just the 3 shots of the 3 locations, it's that all 3 of the previous locations have a shot to repeat as well. And so it's less like a 1 in 100 and more like, oh no, this actually, it's like, it seems like it would be about 9%. And that actually is shockingly close to what it actually ends up being. So taking all of that into account, what did we learn? This is a bit of a complex table, but I'll simplify it down to the actually most simple thing. It's 8.7%. It's 8.7%. That's how likely it is. You see that in the very corner down there? 8.7%. 8.7%? Like, I know. I shouldn't be so surprised, right? That's what our simulator got us. That's what our theory told us would be the range, but like it still feels wrong. And I think a lot of people like to think about this like, oh, it's confirmation bias, right? People are noticing it more. And I think there is something to that idea where it's like, all right, the real culprit of location batching is confirmation bias. You notice it when it happens, but not when it doesn't. And sure, you do. But I think more than that, what's actually happening here is an event that we as humans assume to be unlikely is actually just pretty likely. So let's put that into context. I did a little bit of Marvel Snap math, and I wanted to give you a couple examples of things that are about as likely as this specific thing happening, right? So 8.7%. Here's one. 9.4% of the time, your opponent playing Brood Abs will have Forge into Brood into Absorbing Man. That's what we're talking about here. This is roughly the same likelihood of occurring as your Forge Brood opponent drawing the nuts by turn 4. Here's another one. Again, it's like the same math, right? Your Galactus opponent having Nebula into Wave into Galactus by turn 4. It's the same chance. Like these are the things we should be bracketing it with, and we just aren't, right? Nobody is like, oh my God, they did it again when your opponent does that. But everyone is like, oh my God, how is this real when you get a location that was in your previous game, even though their relative chances are basically incredibly similar. Like it's about 9.4% to have specific card on 2, specific card on 3, specific card on 4, right? And that is not very far removed from that 8.7. And we seem to think of it more like an impossibility. And that is, I think, the thing I wanted to really drill down on in this video. This is not a case of confirmation bias. It's a case of humans are just bad at understanding how likely things are. Like, I did not believe in location batching, and I was still shocked at the number and how likely this was. Like, I was blown away. I'll disclose also that even the people, like I asked the guys at Snap.fan, hey, can you double check the math on these weights? Just let me know if they changed anything. I'm doing a location batching video, and one of them was like, yeah, I totally believe there's location batching. And it's like this is not something that is not widespread. Very smart people believe this, and it really goes to show just how limiting the human brain is, I feel, where we're so built for pattern recognition that we can't even take a step back and say, like, wait a minute, how likely is this to happen? And the answer is still shocking. Like, this is a pretty likely thing to happen. If you play 7 rounds of Conquest on average, this will happen in like 40% of your conquests. That's crazy to me. Like, that's just nuts. It's really, really remarkable. And I think like a lot of the claims about this are like, you know, okay, one of the specific one that set me on this tangent was someone on Twitter saying like, I guarantee this will happen to you in an hour, right? And the implication there is it shouldn't happen in an hour, but then we did the math and like, it should almost always happen to you in an hour. It should almost always happen to you in an hour of playing Marvel Snap. You should almost always see this. And that is just crazy pants to me. Like, it's really remarkable. We had no idea how likely this was, but the entire world just assumed it was like probably not very likely. Only it is. Here's the math to prove it.